People coming in. Hello, everyone. Wait for everyone to file into the webinar. Let's see. All right, hello. My name is Chris, and welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. I'm very pleased to be hosting the Night of the Andrews with Andrew Altschul and Andrew Moxon. You can buy their books at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and then it's also in the chat. I'll introduce them both now. Andrew Altschul is the author of 3 novels, The GRINGA, Deus Ex Machina, and Lady Lazarus, and an O. Henry Prize-winning short story writer. A former Wallace Stegner Fellow and Jones Lecturer at Stanford, he is the Director of Creative Writing at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Andrew Moxon is a writer who runs the popular Twitter handle @JuliusGoat. He lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and The Revisionaries is his first novel. You'll be able to ask questions through the chat function on your screen, and I'll hand it over now. Thanks.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Powerhouse Arena. We flipped the virtual coin, and I'm gonna read first, followed by Andrew. And then we'll talk a little. I got a lot of things I want to ask this guy, and maybe he's got something he wants to ask me, and then we'll see what questions there might be from the audience. But before we start, I just want to say a really big thank you to Powerhouse, which is one of my favorite bookstores in New York, and actually was the first bookstore that I ever did a New York reading in. That was, I guess it was about 9 years ago when my second novel, Deus Ex Machina, came out, and I did a reading at Powerhouse Arena with Nick Flynn that I still remember as just kind of one of the more enjoyable events I've ever done. So thank you for having me back, albeit virtually, and also thanks to AR Moxon. I've been really looking forward to doing this event with him and talking about his book, The Revisionaries, which is just kind of one of the most mind-blowing books I've read in a long time. So I'm looking forward to hearing him read from it. But before that, I will read from The GRINGA, which came out in March from Melville House Books. And I'm going to read a sort of abridged version of the prologue. So there's not very much I need to do to set it up, except to say that The GRINGA was inspired by a real story about an American woman named Lori Berenson, who in 1995 was arrested in Lima, Peru, and tried in a military court for terrorist activities and treason, and convicted and sentenced to life in prison. So that inspired this story. In The GRINGA, the character's name is Leonora Gelb, and this is like I said, from the prologue of the novel, where the narrator, whose name is Andres, is kind of setting up the story that he is about to unfold. The 1998 press conference was the first time most Peruvians had seen Leonora Gelb, 8 hectic minutes in which her fate was all but sealed. Raw-eyed and hoarse, she marched into the room without an introduction, turning upon the reporters her battered, vengeful gaze. "The real danger to Peruvians is not the Cuarta Filosofia, it's their own government," she cried. "The worst violence in this country is state violence. Ask the campesinos whose land was stolen, whose children are dying. Ask the people whose brothers and husbands have disappeared." It was a Tuesday morning, the ragged end of a restive, clammy winter. The basement room stank of shoe polish and spilled coffee. 3 days earlier, the house she was renting in the leafy Pueblo Libre neighborhood had been sacked by special forces, ravaged, its windows blown out, its white walls strafed. They dragged the bodies of 6 militants from that house, flaunted them to reporters while the president walked through the wreckage and shook soldiers' hands. A demon, he'd called her, flapping her passport at the TV cameras, a psychopath. For 3 days, she'd been locked away while the press stoked public fury. Now she stood surrounded by nervous soldiers, their rifles at the ready, as if to sell her, to sell the idea of her. Someone who required such precautions must be dangerous indeed. But the demon was doll-sized, something farcical about her wild, wiry hair, her wet pants. In her powder blue sweatshirt and granny glasses, she looked more like a third-grade teacher than a murderous subversive. They couldn't match this figure to the footage the whole country had seen. The burning house, the smashed gates, smoke whirling up into searchlights like a vision of apocalypse. They didn't see a monster until she opened her mouth to speak. "No one can deny the terrible inequality," she said. "No one can deny the racism and exploitation that keep millions in poverty while a tiny group enriches itself." Her Spanish was perfect, but her accent gave her statement a mechanical, robotic air. "This country was founded on violence, built on violence. The wealthy protect their privilege with violence." "Just shut up already," someone called out. There was low laughter, a ripple in the crowd. They could see steam on her glasses, a stain creeping down her thighs. "Why were there guns in the house, Leo?" another voice called, and then a deluge. "Who stole the military uniforms? Leo, why did you have blueprints of Congress? Were you working with the Cubans? Leo!" "Is this justice?" Leo cried. "Is it democracy? Leo, were you the girlfriend of Agustin Dueñas? Do you work for the CIA, Leo? Where is Mateo Peña, Leo? Did you know Angelica Ramos was in the Shining Path? Did you know she was a killer? Are you a terrorist, Leo?" At this, she pulled up, blinking. The room took a breath. "Leonora, are you a terrorist?" Her eyes scanned the back wall as though looking for a familiar face. The question came again and she licked her lips, a whole country waiting for her answer. Years later, in the forsaken silence of her prison cell, she would still lie awake, contemplating a word. She would turn it over in her mind, try to understand its nature, to find her reflection in its empty depths. "Leonora, are you a terrorist?" The present work is, among other things, an attempt to answer that question. It was begun in April 2008, 10 years after her arrest, trial, and conviction. It was begun under circumstances that are somewhat cloudy, even or especially to me. But in the most concrete sense, it began as an article for My.World, the self-styled online omnivorous media behemoth launched 5 years prior by Jackson Durst. You'll recall the site's ambitious tagline, "All the news." From the start, it was a poor fit for that outlet, owing to the complexity of the subject matter and the attention span of the target audience, to say nothing of the limitations of its author. Put simply, it should never have been assigned to me. But it was, and I've done what I could. What was it Donald Rumsfeld said about going to war with the army you have? Subsequent events further hindered my progress, which is to say I had neither the experience nor the skills necessary to the undertaking. Anyone might have predicted this. Many, in fact, did. But poor preparation and a general lack of knowledge rarely dissuade the powerful once they've set their course. Quite the opposite, actually, as our country's recent misadventures once again make plain. Once fate pointed its palsied finger, there was no turning back. The story, it would seem, was doomed from the start, destined for this sorry, unsatisfying form. I suppose it's also true that my background, my obsessions and personal concerns played a role, whatever my best intentions. Detachment, objectivity, qualities natural to responsible journalists seem not to be my strengths. If they were, I might never have left the US. I might have stayed to enjoy the ongoing calamity of our own dirty war with its unsavory protagonists and hideous mistakes. But for all that, I set out, if reluctantly, to tell Leonora's story, not my own. I set out to understand her, to say something valuable and true. I knew there was more to her than a photo, more than shocking headlines. Of course I knew. What I didn't know, what I could not have known, was what her story would come to mean to me, nor how badly I would need to see it through. So, was she or was she not a terrorist? In these pages, I've tried to sort through the evidence to determine what she wanted, what she might have felt. From disparate fragments and glaring absences, I've tried to build a coherent narrative, one that does justice to the history and its many victims. I've tried to keep my own feelings out of it. I've tried to consider all sides. But it's been more than a decade. The words terror, freedom, democracy, war don't mean the same things anymore. "Leo," the reporters shouted. Her hesitation had made them predatory. "Answer the question." A man stood on a chair and yelled, "Fuck you, Leo, and fuck the philosophers. How many of them did you have sex with, Leo? Leo, why did you come to this country? Why do you want to kill Peruvians? How are they treating you in jail, Leo? Have you been raped?" The soldiers moved to quiet them. Leonora's breath came heavily, a shadow of alarm playing across her face. Everyone waited. Just as it seemed there would be no answer, the prisoner cleared her throat. The Quarta Filosofia is not a terrorist organization, she said. The sudden crush caught the soldiers off guard. Tape rolling, flashes exploding. Leo, they called out. Leo! Is it terrorism to love freedom, she said? Is it terrorism to hate injustice, to feed people who are hungry? She lifted her broken arm as far as she could, the hand white and clammy, clenched with the effort. When I watch the clip, I see her trying to quiet the crowd, to finish what she wanted to say. But the press told a different story, repeated it until it became its own truth. La Leo raised her fist in defiance. She made a gesture of militant solidarity. She dug her own grave. There are no terrorists in the Quarta Filosofia, Leo said. It's a revolutionary movement fighting to improve the lives of people who've been forgotten. She craned her neck, her voice cracking. If it's terrorism to help poor mothers and sick children, then I'm a terrorist. If it's a crime to stand for workers and the oppressed, then I accept whatever punishment I'm given. And there it was, the red meat, the money shot. Every newspaper in Peru ran the photo the next morning, the hysterical savage, the white girl brandishing her fist, with the identical headline, Yo soy terrorista. It was a disaster. A kind of suicide. Her captors could not believe their ears. At the US Embassy, lawyers smacked their desks. In a room at the Lima Sheraton where they'd waited 3 days to see their daughter, her father hunched on the bed and sobbed. Her mother, standing, swore under her breath. 5 days later, Leonora Gelb was sentenced to life in prison for treason and leadership of a terrorist group. The prosecutors stood before the judges in their canvas hoods and shrugged the matter out of his hands. Señores, he said, the prisoner has already confessed. Thank you. So that is from the prologue of the Gringa, now available from Powerhouse Books. Thank you for listening. And now I have the distinct privilege of putting myself on mute and listening to a writer I really admire read from his debut novel. So here, without further ado, is A.R. Moxon to read from The Revisionaries.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. And I'll let Andrew's thanks to Powerhouse stand for myself as well. The other Andrew number 2. When I was asked to join this, I wasn't sure if it was a 2 enter, 1 leave sort of situation. My book actually has 2 Andrews in it. It has 2 characters, both named Andrew, and they're little people, and they are ninjas, and they're probably the deadliest characters in a book full of rather deadly characters. So I find it both amusing and serendipitous that one of my early events would be a night of 2 Andrews. If you read my book, you'll find that something happens to the Andrews that is difficult to explain. I will not be reading that, but I just want to express again my thanks to Andrew for bringing me along on this night of 2 Andrews. I'm very glad to be a second Andrew, and I also, just to say, I finished reading the Gringa a couple days ago. I really admire it. I admire its honesty. I found it to be a really gripping novel. So it is a mutual admiration society here. Now, after a reading of something rather gripping, I'm going to give you a reading of something a little weird. So this is going to be our main character, Gordy. As a child, he has just found a secret circus, and he has been working at a scratch-off lottery ticket that a strange man in powder blue suit gave him, which seems to have given him access to this circus. Here we go. He's still agonizing over his final choice when the lights go out and a hush falls in waves over the crowd. The circus of breaded love has begun. With haste, Gordy deposits the ticket safe into his pocket, relieved to put off the moment of disappointment. The Colonel stands center stage, awash in light, his trademark patois made incomprehensible by a huge red bullhorn. Suddenly, the air is full of lithe and spangled tumblers in blue and red and white leotards, swinging in wide loops from metal batons attached to wires so thin one can easily imagine them invisible, lending the acrobats the illusion of flight. The tumblers barely touch the bars, swinging wild and at seeming random, catching for the briefest moment before flying out once again into the void, somersaulting and catching the next baton as if only by chance. Gordy tries to count the acrobats, but it's an impossible task. They crisscross and fly too quickly. There may be 5 of them. There may be 7. There may be 10. The batons are being swung across the expanse by 10 clowns clinging to short chrome fire poles, which have descended from neat holes in the tent roof. These clowns are arranged at intervals around the trapeze rig and hang from the poles by their legs, leaving their arms free. They catch the batons in white-gloved hands and throw them out again in the general direction of the trapeze artists, carelessly, without aim or purpose or urgency, and sometimes, holy hell, they miss the baton entirely and it floats indifferently away. Gordy is chewing the insides of his cheeks. He frets with fear. He thrums with vicarious adrenaline. Impossible for this to end well. There's no sense here, no pattern. There will be a collision. A clown will fail to throw a crucial baton, will throw too soon or too late to meet an acrobat in her moment of need. The indifference of the clowns is terrifying and exhilarating. The tumblers depend entirely upon the whims of these buffoons. Below, Gordy sees nothing to halt a fall but the most impractical arrangement, a mere sop to safety. 3 small black trampolines arranged in a triangle at a height of 10 feet, none of them larger than a child's inflatable pool. Meanwhile, 100 feet up, these fools practice their arbitrary tosses and catches. Gordy wants to cover his eyes. He winces with each hush of the crowd. The clowns are in danger themselves as they lean out to make their catches. They must have feet like monkeys. Gordy can't understand how they remain on their poles. Still, there must be some method. Somehow the acrobats keep aloft. Somehow a baton always floats by to meet them, and they flip and turn, catching the baton, or sometimes, unbearably, missing it, but then catching 1 heart-pounding second later the feet of another tumbler who's being held arm in arm by yet another, who hangs inverted from his bar by the knees. And then the 3 danglers each see a baton all their own and go spinning off in different directions. The faith of the acrobats infects the crowd, and they begin to laugh, delighted at the madness or caught in it. Every second that passes without fatality is a new miracle. The production is effortless and impossible, complex and happenstance, flight and gravity, all at once. Gordy is in the midst of deciding whether he is watching the skillful enactment of endless rehearsal or the improvisational trapeze act of highly proficient lunatics, trying to find some hint that even the misses are all a part of the dance, when there at last comes an accident. The clowns shriek with the crowd as 3 acrobats simultaneously miss their bars with no rescue and fall to earth, feet pointed down, straight as arrows, the crowd rising to its feet with horror and anticipation, then groaning in furious relief and joyous disappointment as each of the 3 of them lands directly in the center of one of those 3 trampolines, stretching deep dimples into the elastic until the metal rings of the tramps are level with the crowns of their heads, and then shooting back up, rising and rising, and eschewing the batons the panicking clowns toss their way as they ascend, nearly touching the tent roof, holding, for the briefest instance, at the top of their trajectory, consecrated in the absolution of flux, the moment between rising and falling that is neither and both, and in a heartbeat, an instant, Gordy sees that the center one is a heartbreaking beauty, a woman with dark hair shot with gold, and in the way of boys, he is immediately in love. Yes, love. She's the love of his life. But then they begin their plunge, and now it really is time to eat your goiter, ladies and gents, because even as they fall precisely down, whatever springs were in those ridiculous triumvirate tramps are shot for sure. But wait, in the commencement of their fall, the three stop, hold, and float, and the crowd has forgotten how even to scream. Captured, the acrobats jounce up and down on consecrated air as if standing on an atmosphere of jelly. The audience stares at the hovering figures, amazed, stunned. These are not performers, they are yogis, mystics, wizards, holy people. They have mastered air, they have tamed gravity. But wait, the other four acrobats are swinging in higher arcs, and higher they release their batons and hurtle upward to join their comrades. 7 of them, standing on nothing at all. And then the silence is shattered as the crowd sees, in uproarious unison, the 7 spider silk tightrope stretched across the tent, and they roar their weak-kneed approval. At this moment, the poles from which the clowns are suspended detach from their fixtures, and the fools swing one-handed, tossing their now detached silver poles to the men and women on the tightrope. At the apex of their swing, each clown releases, double somersaults, lands on one of the platforms, and bows. And below, everyone hoots and brays at their fabulous funambulism. They descend down ladder as the tumblers begin the tightrope routine, not walking the tightrope, you understand, but using their poles to vault, hopscotching from wire to wire, somersaulting hodgepodge past one another in catastrophic hurdle, sometimes jousting with one another, twisting just before collision. The crowd rises to its feet and commences stamping, which throws off the pattern of the bleachers' sway, the pattern Gordy has unconsciously learned to ride. Without warning, it whips, sharp as a roller coaster, to the left. For Gordy, staring with wonder between splayed fingers, himself rising to his feet, this is enough to disrupt his equilibrium, topple him. He overcompensates, pinwheels his arms, screams, tilts, falls. No one sees him go. None take note of a boy disappearing between bleachers and canvas backing. Gordy hardly notices it himself. So caught up is he in a frisson of sympathetic tension for the plight of the tightrope vaulters. So there we go. So convinced the deadly fall is imminent for them that when he finds himself falling, surprise barely registers. It seems axiomatic. If they are to so boldly defy physical laws, then some other must pay gravity's price. This is it, he thinks, and even as he thinks it, he hits. Okay, so that was from this guy, The Revisionaries. Also available in fine bookstores, including Powerhouse from Melville House. Speaking of Melville House, both of our books are published by Melville House, named after the famous author of Moby Dick. Both of our books introduce Moby Dick at key moments.
That's right.
Both of our books include a character that is almost an author self-insert,
Right.
that almost has our name.
So any authors out there listening, clearly if you want a book to be published by Melville House, just stick Moby Dick in there, and it's a ringer, right? And an author proxy can't hurt.
I'm not saying nothing. I'm just saying. So it's interesting to me, you know, as I'm reading along, I'm noticing these parallels between two very, on the surface level anyway, very different books. They both also include a character who is trying to rid himself or herself of their perceived privilege.
Right.
And failing. And yours has got at least a couple of those. So I guess what I'm wondering is, just to kind of kick off a conversation, I see a lot of things that you're doing with your self-insert character. And I'm not going to ask you, is that you? Because it's not, I know that, but I am interested in what led you to that.
Yeah.
And if that was there from the start, if it started with Laurie Berenson and then you realized that it was also interrogating you, or if it was something else.
Yeah, that's a great question. It really goes to the heart of of all of the challenges this novel posed for me. It took me 8 years to write this novel, and figuring out like who to tell it and from what standpoint was really one of the hardest things to do, and the really complicated thing to do. The novel started because I lived in Peru for a couple of years shortly after Berenson had been arrested and incarcerated, and she was still very much in the news. And every time she would come back into the news for one reason or another, the press would go crazy. I mean, she was an absolutely loathed figure in Peru, even on the left, where one might have expected to find people more sympathetic to her. But in fact, if anything, most of the people that I knew and encountered who considered themselves leftists hated her even more. They felt that she had discredited leftist politics in post-war Peru, and that she was, this outsider, this gringa who had come and sort of poked her nose into something that she didn't understand very well, that she had no business inserting herself into. And so that story stuck with me for a long time. I think it was a while before I knew I would write a novel about it. But once I did start kind of taking notes for the novel in around 2010, 2011, after Berenson had been paroled, it was very quickly obvious to me that this wasn't going to be a novel that I could tell from a straightforward kind of quasi-omniscient point of view. There were too many things that were outside of my experience. There were too many things that ran against the grain of my own identity. Most crucially, being a privileged white American trying to tell a story about another country that had experienced, this national upheaval, this national trauma of their war against the Shining Path that resulted in 70,000 dead Peruvians. And for me to kind of step in and try to tell some authoritative story about that, just artistically and ethically speaking, was kind of a non-starter. Mm-hmm. And so I really cast around for a long time. And even as I was committed to the novel, I was making kind of annual research trips back to Peru to talk to just dozens of people about their experience of the war and their experience of the 90s, which was the post-war recovery period. And at one point I was talking to a journalist friend of mine, a Canadian, but who had lived there, for more than 20 years. And I just said to her, I'm having so much trouble figuring out how to write this novel because who am I to talk about these things? Who am I to sort of insert my own take on this period and this history? And she said, well, you're Laurie Berenson. And I was really taken aback by that.
Right.
But what she meant was, you're coming at this story in much the same way that Berenson came at post-war Peruvian politics. You're someone who knows this country, but not so well. You speak the language, but not like a native speaker. You have things that you want to say about this country, but your own experience and your own identity really blinds you to the full reality of it. And so when she pointed out that parallel to me, that both of us in a way were interlopers, both of us were gringos, that's what really unlocked it for me. And I realized, well, if I was going to tell this story that I had so many concerns about my own right to the material, then the story would have to cop to that. The story, it would have to be baked into the way that the story was told, that the person telling it and you got, you know, just a little sense of him in that prologue, that the person telling it would realize that he really is not qualified to tell it at all. I mean, he's compelled to tell it, but he knows damn well that he's not really equipped, and in some ways he doesn't really have the right to tell it. So that, you know, that's where that character comes from, and he's named Andres, which is, as you point out, you know, somewhat close to Andrew. He's not me exactly. He's not you exactly, Andrew. But he,
and neither is he to small ninjas.
he's not a ninja either. Far from it. He would make a terrible ninja. You know, but he does sort of represent in a lot of ways my own understanding of, you know, what it means for an outsider like me, or like Leonora Gelb, to insert themselves into a story that has, in which other people have much more at stake than we do. I think that's the best that I can put it.
It seemed, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, it seemed to me almost as if it were about the impossible. Leonora Gelb is trying to be the good guy and discovering the impossibility of that. That's what it seemed like to me. And at the same time, Andreas is trying to do a good job and finding the impossibility of that. I'm just wondering, I mean, did you feel like, did you feel that as well? Or did you, which is not to say that it was impossible for you to tell a good story, because you have, but I mean, did you feel that sort of pressure? Or did you feel that sort of I don't know if hopelessness is the word, but the impossibility of that?
Well, I mean, all of the above. And I also wanted to really dig at that and see what came out of it. I mean, because, you know, we all know what the road to hell is paved with, right? And parachuting into other places and other cultures and other people's stories with, you know, a minimum of preparation and a complete obliviousness to the impact that we have on those cultures. I mean, that is as American as apple pie, right? I mean, this just happened again last week, where a bunch of Yahoo mercenary guys from South Florida tried to gin up a coup in Venezuela, you know, got captured because they were, you know, bozos. And now they're screaming for the American government to get them out of there. You know, and if we weren't all distracted by the pandemic, you can darn well bet that Fox News and Trump would be banging the table about the brutality and the atrocity of the Venezuelan government, and how dare they hold these, you know, Americans who just came to try to help the people of Venezuela. You know, how dare they not release them? I guarantee you that's what would be happening. That's what was happening for the first couple of years of Lori Berenson being in prison, right? You know, Jesse Jackson was in Lima, and Bill Richardson was talking to the Peruvian government, and Madeleine Albright, and there was every expectation that that the U.S. would make enough noise that sort of international pressure would build to release this poor innocent American who had just wanted to help. Never mind the fact that she was accused of trying to stage a military invasion on the country's Congress and abduct their legislators, right? What happened in her case, at least my interpretation of it, is 9/11. You know, 3 or 4 years after she's in prison, just when it seemed like there might be some momentum to have her let go, suddenly you have the September 11th attacks. And at that point, you know, I think a lot of people in the US government who might previously have been interested in trying to secure her release kind of heard for the first time what it would sound like from the other side to be saying, a foreigner came into your country and according to you committed a terrorist attack, and we want you to let her go because, you know, she's misunderstood or she had good intentions. It was not something politically that anybody anymore was willing to espouse. And so that was the end of that. And she ended up serving out most of her sentence until she was released. But yeah, I wanted to build that into the book, that idea of this very American habit of thought that, you know, whether it's to go somewhere to be an expat and write a novel about all of, you know, the drinking that you did and the exploits that you've had. And, you know, I don't want to name names, but like some, you know, some pretty well regarded recent novels have just reiterated that trope that goes all the way back to The Sun Also Rises, if not to Twain. You know, whether it's an American going in and making another country a backdrop for his self-discovery, or an American going in and trying to restart a revolution, it's just a very it's a very American thing to do, to think that you know, that this other country with its history and its culture and its conflicts and its politics is the backdrop to our own desires, or our own wishes for how the world ought to look. I think I got kind of far afield from the original question, but hopefully I got close to some kind of satisfying answer.
No, that was a satisfying answer for me.
Good.
What's your level? What was your level of sympathy for Leo, your character, Leo Gelb?
Totally mixed, totally impossible to tease out. I mean, in the same way that my feelings about Laurie Berenson are very, very complicated. I mean, on the one hand, here's someone who clearly has had far more of the courage of her convictions than I ever had. I mean, even though we probably share some political takes on things, you know, you've never found me putting anything really significant on the line in the name of those beliefs. I mean, I've marched in my share of demonstrations, I've held my picket signs, but you know, this is someone who felt that there was a moral imperative, that she couldn't live if she thought she hadn't done everything possible to alleviate suffering, to alleviate oppression, and she paid a really extreme price for it. And part of me really admires that. Another part of me fears it, and you know, certainly can't condone her actions if they were even, you know, if they were even close to what she was accused of doing. It's not something that I would ever admire or approve of. So toggling back and forth between that kind of horror at what she was said to be planning, you know, the ways that she was characterized, but also a real sense of a sense that here is someone who has taken her beliefs farther than I ever have, and maybe a kind of curiosity about myself, or even shame that I have, you know, risked so little for the things that I believe in. I mean, those were the kind of opposing forces that drew me to the character and that I tried to build into the book. I want to ask you, you know, a similar kind of origin question about how the Revisionaries came to be. I mean, it's such a gigantic and complex and thrillingly unpredictable book. You know, at some level, the question I actually want to ask you is, like, if I opened up your skull, would I see like a human brain, or like some kind of MC Escher print where everything kind of doubles back on itself in wild ways? I won't ask you that question. That's not really fair. But but in the acknowledgments at the end of the Revisionaries, you mentioned that in some ways the origins of the story come like well before you started writing it, in a kind of I don't know if game is the right word, but like an ongoing riff that you and a friend had about a place called Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. And I'm just fascinated to know how, you know, that kind of shooting the shit with your friends spins out into this, you know, remarkably complicated narrative web.
Yeah. So I will tell the short version of that story. First of all, if you open my brain, you'll find thousands and thousands of tiny little Andrews. And each one of them contains thousands of tiny Andrews. I can't go into it further
You're like
than
the Cat in the Hat.
Yeah, it's Andrews all the way down. This is the night of a billion Andrews. Yes, so there came a point in my life where I was living with my friend Ben, who actually is listening in right now.
Great.
And he and I were writers, in that we talked about being writers, but we didn't write anything. At a certain point, I realized that was a problem. So I wrote a bunch of sentences down. He chose the one that was sort of a Kafka riff. It was, if the memory serves, about a man who woke up and realized that he had just changed into sandals. And we went back and forth. He wrote some stuff. He sent it to me. I wrote some stuff. I sent it to him. We basically did it to amuse ourselves, but it was interesting to me, and things about it caught on. And I would say, maybe 10 years later, after we had written hundreds of pages of this stuff, and we had traveled to Pigeon Forge to try and kind of find it, because he had written, in one of the very first bits of this, he had written about this character named Tennessee, who was obsessed with this idea that he was never going back to Pigeon Forge. And I believe Pigeon Forge, he was never going back to Pigeon Forge because Ben had been to Pigeon Forge and thought it to be a place full of rather useless things for sale, and just sort of an uncomfortable place to be, surrounded by all of this natural beauty. It's a gorgeous part of the world. So we went there, and I was looking for this sort of connective tissue, and we were in this cheap motel, and we had been bumming around Pigeon Forge all day. And I pulled out Gideon's Bible, and I opened it, and it went right to the book of Jonah, which gave me, not to go too far into it, but it gave me a spine for the plot. Because we had been trying to figure out, who is this Gordy? And I thought, well, what if he's a prophet? What if he's a prophet that's running from God? And that carried us forward. Now, the two of us wrote this for many, hundreds of pages, and then we kind of set it down. Ben went to the Peace Corps. I had started a family. Twin babies don't make for a lot of time for writing, but I kept thinking about it, and I finally arrived at a point where I realized that I had accrued all of these other thoughts, that every time that I would have something that just kind of fit in to this worldview of the universe as being like art, in that it is at its core collaborative. And so I had this idea, and then I had this plot spine. And I knew that I wanted to take everything, as much as possible, that we had put in, to honor the collaboration that it had grown from. And in so doing, honoring the idea of the universe as being something collaborative. And I realized that to bring everything in, I could do it, but it was going to make the book really, 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 really complicated. And so that's what I did. Because
that's right. You didn't off it complicated, but I think it's a big fat book, and it's a complicated book, but it offers the reader so many pleasures, so many different kinds of pleasures. I mean, the scene you read, which is just a kind of bravura moment in the novel, that's one very distinct kind of pleasure that the novel gives, that kind of just everything flying all over the place,
right.
That kind of spectacle. And then it has these very intellectual pleasures of kind of tracking out the ways that the story changes and escapes from you, and revises and self-revises. And so I want to kind of ask, I mean, I love that idea of it as a novel that sprang from this collaboration between you and Ben. And Ben is popping up in the chat to take his credit, and I don't blame him. But I also want to ask, sort of, the the pedigree question or the influence question, because there's a lot in here about like secret societies and alternative universes and tunnels, things going on under the life that we see every day that reminds me so much of Thomas Pynchon. But then there's also a kind of zaniness that makes me think of somebody like Tom Robbins or even Douglas Adams or someone like that. I mean, who are the writers you feel are formative that you kind of heard in your own work as you were spinning out the Revisionaries?
Yeah, those two for sure. And you know, if you describe the plot, I think people immediately say those two. I remember describing it to a friend really early on, like, this is what I think it's about. And that was immediately, oh, that sounds like a Tom Robbins book. You know, I would say the primary influence, honestly, would be Ben, because of how much it resembles just a freewheeling conversation between two friends. Like you kind of mentioned, it just goes from a thing to a thing to a thing to a thing, and it kind of doubles back on itself, and in very much the same way as we do that. And so many of the things that are in there because Ben decided that that it was funny, and then I decided that I would make sense of it. That's sort of like, I was like, let's make this fit in. Now, in terms of the literary pedigree, besides those two, you know, one that really comes to mind is Michael Ondaatje, and the way that he uses language, the way that he will poeticize surprising things. I wouldn't quite dare to compare myself to him in his ability to do that, but I was always struck by it, and the idea that every sentence can kind of be to use the vernacular, extra. Every sentence with him is extra in a way that kind of works, and I always strive for that. There's a passage where I'm really, without trying to ape, hopefully, but I had very much in mind Cormac McCarthy. There is a passage where I realized it was very much Ray Bradbury. And that would be the circus. That would be like the Gordy, the circus stuff. The Cormac McCarthy, that would be more when it's Jane Sim writing the history of Isaac Love, where I'm trying to move a little bit more in that tone. And again, you know, hopefully without aping them, but those are sort of the some of the authors that I had in mind. Another one that really came in, I read right before I started really writing in earnest, and it was a master class in withholding and revelation, of giving you the details so that by the time you get to the reveal, you know it, was The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood. Huge fan of that book. And particularly I admire that aspect of it. I'm sure there are, I mean, you know, millions more, but those are ones that kind of stand out right now in the moment.
Yeah.
And we've got a question here actually from Rob Handel, wondering if you would answer that influences question as well.
Yeah, I will happily, and that's a good on-ramp for us to remind everyone that you can ask us questions using the Q&A function. I have a feeling that these two Andrews could kind of talk amongst themselves for many hours, but we'd love to hear what you're interested in and try to speak to that. My own influences with this novel, you know, the one of the really challenging things with this novel was trying to figure out exactly what the choreography was of the little dance that I had to do with real history and with real people, especially since you know, the central figure in the story, or who inspired the story, is still living, but also because, you know, we're talking about like great historical and geopolitical events, and how do you work that into the shape of a novel. And so, you know, there were a handful of novels that I really looked to as touchstones for this book, primarily, and with, you know, eternal gratitude, is E.L. Doctorow's novel, The Book of Daniel, which is a fictionalizing of the case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were executed in the 50s as Soviet spies, but who for the most part were basically a couple of very poor and desperate Jews from Brooklyn who had kind of an interest in making a difference in the Cold War, and got caught up in something, you know, much bigger than that, and were convicted of treason and executed for it. And that is really, I think, one of the most remarkable novels of the 20th century. I can't recommend it highly enough. A handful of more recent novels that have taken on a similar project, although each of them handles it a little bit differently, would be like DeLillo's Libra, of course, which tries to tell the story of Lee Harvey Oswald leading up to the Kennedy assassination. Susan Choi's American Woman, which is sort of tells a story peripheral to the Patty Hearst kidnapping. Let's see, Dana Spiotta's Eat the Document. These are all novels that take a sort of small piece of history and try to really look into it for deeper psychology, deeper thematics, and deeper overall meaning than one could ever get just by reading the history books or the newspaper headlines. And so that was my project from the get-go. And I just went back to these books again and again to try to see, you know, what kind of tricks these writers had up their sleeves. Thanks for that question. And we're willing to take others. Here we go. Here's one for you, Andrew. Could you talk about the fonts?
The fonts.
It must have been a copy editor's nightmare with all the kind of formatting craziness that goes on here.
So the first of all, the fonts were the biggest surprise to me, not in terms of an author's discovery as one writes it, but that they actually let me get away with it. I wrote this thing. You know, just as a little bit of table setting. This is my first book. It's also my first published work. It's also my first attempt at a published work. I was somebody who kind of always thought about writing a novel, and I had one I wanted to write, and it just took me a really long time to get there. And by the time I got there, I did not think it was going to get published. I realized how big it was and how strange. And it's not, if you go looking for, you know, advice columns on how to debut a novel, none of those things are going to be on the checklist. They don't say write a 900-page manuscript that's really weird and dense and make sure you put a lot of weird fonts in it. But that freed me up to basically do whatever pleased me. And what I realized as I started to go was, one of the things that was going to need to start happening was the narrative was going to need to start breaking, because the setting, without too many spoilers, is a narrative that is breaking. And so eventually the narrative was going to have to break, and it was going to splinter. And pretty early on, I hit upon the idea that we were going to be dealing with the same story being told in many different modes. And at that point, it became clear that probably the best way for the two people that I thought I could probably force, you know, guilt into reading it to follow it along was to do different fonts. So that is how I turned it in. And I kept waiting for the day when my editor would be like, and by the way, one thing we have to talk about. And I'd be like, yeah, you got me. All right. We'll just do it all in one font. It's fine. And they went for it. I have to say, they went for all of the crazy things. I was like, well, let's fade out the text. They're like, sure, let's do that. I was like, can you right here have the text so that it goes off the margin. I think that would be fun if it went off. They're like, yeah, sure. I was like, well, how about if we put some pictures in? They're like, yeah, let's do. I have very little cause to complain. Every weird, dumb, or smart, if it worked, I'll take credit, idea they put in. There really wasn't anything. I was like, well, what if we made when he gets stepped on there, what if we just made it a cartoon sort of font where it goes ah, and the A just gets bigger and bigger and then smaller and smaller? Can we do that? And they're like, yeah, sure, let's do that. So anyway, that's the fonts for you.
And you got, I mean, and all credit to Melville. I mean,
Absolutely.
My book wasn't challenging in the design sense, I don't think, but that story and my own experience with them really goes to them, them being really game for trying things out, and willing to work with us, with our strange books. There's a question about politics in the novels. Can we talk about how our work reflects or addresses or not our current political moment? And if I may sort of kick that one off,
Sure.
The interesting thing for me with this novel was I started writing this novel in 2011, and what I thought I was writing, I mean, aside from a very specific historical story, but if you read the novel, you'll see that Andres is carrying his own politics around, even if he tries to keep it quiet. He's left the U.S. In the wake of the Iraq invasion of 2003, post 9/11 politics in general, the Patriot Act, the surveillance state, and especially the detainee abuses at the Abu Ghraib prison. And he's just said, I'm leaving in disgust. I want to live an apolitical life. I want to live somewhere where I don't have to think about this, demonstrating, of course, that American privilege of being able to sort of live a life where you don't have to think about politics and where you can just go somewhere and reinvent yourself. But politics kind of find him and he gets dragged back into it as he tells Leonora Gelb's story. So I thought I was writing in 2011, 12, 13. I thought I was writing a novel looking back at the Bush era and the atrocities that we experienced as a country. And I still think, there's a lot about that we haven't fully digested or come to terms with as a country. The fact that among other truly despicable things, our country invaded another country on false pretenses, made up a story from whole cloth about why we should invade that country, killed 500,000 of their citizens, displaced 3 or 4 million more, really just to kind of gratify the ambitions of a certain handful of neoconservatives who thought that spreading democracy and the American way was really a great way to use the American military. We haven't come to terms with that as a country, and one of the things I wanted to do in writing the book was to have my character trying to come to terms with that and draw the connections between that attitude and the same attitude that impels, a 26-year-old woman to a country that she's never set foot in before in her life to try to join the movement, to join the revolution, and ends up spending her life in a military prison. What happens is it takes me so long to write this book that by the time I'm finishing it up and publishing it, we have a whole new set of American atrocities and American misbehavior to complain about, and a whole new administration to bemoan and to feel deeply ashamed of. So there was a way that the rug kind of got pulled out under me just by the passage of time as I was trying to write the book. Of course, it's a very dodgy proposition to work politics as explicitly into a novel as I tried to do. But when I started writing it, I just found myself, personally, not even artistically, I was just in a place where I still felt so angry and confused by what our country had done in the 2000s that it just wasn't going to be possible for me to write something where that didn't leak into it. With the politics that find their ways into the revisionaries, Andrew, I mean, were you wary or kind of cautious of this line? I mean, so often we're told that politics and fiction don't mix. I mean, we're told that in America, the only literary culture in the world that really subscribes to that. But it's a very clear message that we get from a lot of teachers and editors and readers. So how did you kind of make your peace with it?
Well, I made my peace with it by never having any readers or editors or teachers. That's how I dodged that one. I didn't know. I really didn't edit it or self-censor at all, and it just became naturally political. It's a very strange book, but it's about very real things to me. It wasn't about specific things, although there were a couple specific parallels, to mental patients being thrown out in the streets and turned into homeless, and then thereby turned into criminals, and that sort of thing. Our main antagonist is somebody whose family owns prisons, and things like that. But for the most part, it focused on, I think, the spiritual roots of these issues of a culture that considers some people worth life and others not, that believes that wealth is how you earn that life, and warehouses those that aren't, and also of a large group of people who make themselves willingly amnesiac to it. So that it's certainly seeped its way into the pictures that I made, and I think that those, I thought that I had made my antagonist Morris too cartoonishly evil, and he would never be able to actually survive. I should have made him president, is what I've said. So that's that. Again, time kind of showed me, like, well, actually, I could have gone even further over the top, probably.
That's right. These characters don't hold a candle to some of the actual people in positions of power, and not only in the U.S., but certainly that's on a lot of our minds right now. And I should add, because somebody mentioned it in the Q&A, that if there's anyone listening to this event who doesn't follow A.R. Moxon on Twitter, he goes by the handle of Julius Goat, and he's someone that I followed long before I had heard of his book, long before his book came out, before I knew that we were going to be publishing on the same label, just because I kind of gravitated to his tweets, which are, brilliant and furious and critical in exactly the right ways. And so I think I was going to find him no matter what. And then to turn out that we're publishing these books roughly around the same time and doing this event together, that's kind of icing on the cake. Someone asked, Andrew, how did you keep track of the revisionaries as you were writing it? This I gotta hear.
Okay, so something about me. Really big, complex stories are sort of my mutant superpower. So I kept it all in my head. I just wrote it out. I didn't really have, once we got into the point where we were editing it and I was having to figure out how to cut about a third of it out, then we got into some spreadsheets and some graphs and some long documents of cosmology and things like that. But up until that point, it was just all in a filing folder in my brain, which, as we've established, is full of Andrews.
That is not the answer I was expecting. I think my if there's such a thing as an anti-superpower, like I guess the Achilles heel or whatnot, is in real life I'm like a very organized person, pretty type A about keeping track of things. And when I write novels, I'm all over the place and I have no idea where things go until I eventually outline them, and I have 700 sticky notes all over the walls of my office, and notebooks with, like, you know, little tabs in them, and big arrows and 6 different colored markers, sort of trying to draw the connections from one thing to another. So the idea that you just kind of held this book in your head while you were getting through it is amazing to me.
That makes me seem a lot more stainless steel pristine than it really, if you think of the famous gif from Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where Charlie's got all of the Post-its and the strings together, and that's the inside of my head. I can just track it, is all. So
you don't buy the actual Post-its.
No, I just don't buy that's right. It's just to save on office supplies. That's all. But you know, the other thing is, you wrote a book that is about at least a stand-in for a real person, and it's about a very real place. You had to honor, you know, you had to honor that. I was really making stuff up in a big way, and so I had to do some research on Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. But beyond that, you know, I think that if I were to make a researched book like that, I probably would have to keep something. The one thing I will say is I made a spreadsheet of the chapters. That's what I did.
Okay.
So I kind of framed it out that far. I said, okay, this chapter should be this person, then this chapter should be this person, and sometimes I'd move those around. So. Yeah,
well, I mean, doing it. All the research on something like this definitely kind of made my task a little harder. And I just a week or so ago, one of my, you know, quarantine luxuries has been finally, like, clearing some crap out of my office now that this book is out. And so I have 3 huge banker file boxes with old newspaper clippings and books, you know, about this period, and books about revolutionary politics in general, and printouts of websites and transcripts and all of this, and, you know, Human Rights Watch case reports, and yeah, you go down the rabbit hole a little bit when there's a big research component to it, and I very much hope that the next story I turn to requires a little bit less of that. Which actually reminds me, there's one more question in the chat, and maybe that would be a good place for us to wrap. But I'm going to adapt it, and just, you know, Rob Handel is asking, like, what would we write in a dream world where we could stop thinking about politics? I'm just going to stipulate that world is probably not likely to come into existence, but maybe, I mean, I'd love to hear what you've turned to now, or what big project you might want to take on next, Andrew, and I'm happy to answer the same question.
So the dream project would be Lost season 7. Let me showrun that. But that's about as likely to happen as a world in which politics are not necessary. So I'm working on a book right now. Say a little bit about it. It's about the end of the world, and everything that happens after that. It starts with the end of the world. So gravity throws everybody off the planet. I'll just say it. Gravity throws everybody off the planet, and everybody dies. And then my book is about everything that happens sort of before and after that.
I think you just wrote the tagline for your flap copy: a novel about the end of the world and everything that happens after that. I mean, that is that's straight out of publicity, Andrew. Congratulations.
That's what I do, baby.
I can't wait to read it. As for me, I am, I'm working on a handful of shorter narratives, which is not to say short narratives, but probably novellas or novelettes. I don't even know. I can't keep track of all the new terminology, but basically what I'm thinking of as a group of novellas, 3 or 4 of them, that dive further into this question of Americans abroad and their, you know, perennial misbehavior, not in the Hemingway-esque sense of drinking too much and sleeping with the wrong women, although, you know, that that happens. But really exploring this idea of what Americans see and understand of the rest of the world, many of the different ways that we feel we have the right to kind of treat it as our playground or the backdrop for our voyages of personal discovery, and the ways that we remain blind or oblivious to the actual people that we encounter, and who don't have the luxury of just leaving and going somewhere else when things get difficult or dangerous or deadly. So there are 3, possibly 4 novellas that I'm hoping will be altogether a book. One of them may or may not be a very strange kind of sequel to the Gringa. We're going to have to see, but that's where my head is at. So it's still political, but trying to get a little more broad, a little less topical than the Gringa.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you. Yeah, I love this Mutual Admiration Society. Really, like, you had me at Andrew.
Yeah.
I was ready to read it even then, but I just want to. I think probably we should wrap this up. It's a little bit after 8 o'clock on the East Coast, and I want to say thank you again to Powerhouse Arena for hosting us. I want to say thank you to Melville House Books for publishing both of us, and I especially want to say thank you to A.R. Moxon, who it's just been a real honor to do this event with you and to talk about these books with you. Please do buy the Revisionaries if you haven't yet. It's you will never read anything else quite like it.
Yeah, it was good times, Andrew. Thanks very much.
Chris, do you have a little wrap up? Do you want an outro?
Yeah. Just thank you to the Andrews, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. If you missed any of the event, it'll be on YouTube soon. And please buy the books. We got the links in the event page and the chat. Every book you buy helps us put on more free events you can donate to. And we'll have the books for 10% off for a limited time only. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Read through the chat here before I depart, because it looks like there's a lot that I missed, but did you see your wife's comment, Andrew?
Yeah. Yes, I did.
This is Andrew's wife. His brain is insane. Okay. and I guess she would know.
Insane in the brain. Insane in the membrane.
Is it spring yet in northern Michigan, Andrew?
Of sorts.
Okay.
After a fashion. It is spring.
I think there were snow flurries in New York today, Chris. Is that true?
Yesterday there were.
Oh my God.
It's wild.
That's insane. We had a beautiful week at the very beginning of April, and then the following week we had a sudden 8-inch blizzard and ice storm that brought down like this huge tree in our backyard. And then the following week it was 65 degrees again. So that's Colorado spring for you.
Mm.
So you'll let us know. You'll send us a link when you've got this up on YouTube or on your social media or wherever it's going.
Yep.
All right. Cool. Well, thanks again. And A.R. Moxon, stay in touch, my friend. This has been great.
Will do.
All right. Cool.
Take care.
Take it easy.
You're welcome.
Both.